The air at 25,000 feet was thin, bitterly cold, and filled with tension. Inside the aluminum fuselage of a B-17 Flying Fortress, waist gunners scanned the pale winter sky over Germany. Frost crept along the inside of the aircraft skin. Oxygen masks fogged with each breath. The droning of 4 Wright Cyclone engines was constant, almost hypnotic. Below them lay the heart of the Third Reich. Above them, nothing but open sky. That was the problem. In 1943, the United States Army Air Forces believed in daylight precision bombing. Factories, oil refineries, ball-bearing plants. These were the arteries of Nazi Germany's war machine. If they could be cut, the war could be shortened. The theory was simple. Heavily armed bombers flying in tight defensive formations could protect themselves. In practice, the sky over Europe became a slaughterhouse. As the bomber formations crossed the German border, contrails marked their path like chalk lines across the stratosphere. Soon, dark specks appeared in the distance. Then more, then dozens. Messerschmitt Bf 109s, Focke-Wulf 190s. The Luftwaffe was waiting. German fighters attacked from every angle. Head-on passes to maximize firepower, diving strikes from above, coordinated group assaults. Cannon shells tore through aluminum skin. Fuel tanks ignited. Control cables snapped. Bombers fell out of formation trailing smoke and flame. The defensive guns of the B-17s were formidable. 50 caliber machine guns bristled from nose, tail, top turret, ball turret, waist positions. But even a flying fortress could not fight forever, especially not alone. Early escort fighters like the P-47 Thunderbolt and the British Spitfire were capable, fast, and deadly, but they lacked one crucial element: range. They could accompany bomber formations across the English Channel and part away into occupied Europe, but not deep into Germany, and certainly not all the way to Berlin. Once the escort fighters reached their fuel limits, they had to turn back. The bombers continued on. Alone, the results were catastrophic. In August 1943, during the Schweinfurt, Regensburg missions, American bombers struck ball-bearing factories critical to the German war effort. The cost was staggering. Dozens of aircraft were shot down. Hundreds of airmen were killed or captured in a single day. Losses climbed to levels that threatened the entire strategic bombing campaign. At those rates, the air war was unsustainable. Crews knew the statistics. They did the math in quiet moments before takeoff. 25 missions to complete a tour. The odds of surviving them all were shrinking with every flight. The Luftwaffe did not need to destroy every bomber. They only needed to destroy enough. Back in England, planners faced an uncomfortable truth. Courage and heavy armament were not enough. Formation flying alone could not overcome a determined, well-organized air defense system fighting over its own territory. The bombers needed something more. They needed a fighter that could stay with them. Not halfway, not part of the journey. All the way to the target and back. A fighter with a range across the North Sea, penetrate deep into Germany, loiter over hostile skies, engage enemy interceptors, and still return safely to base. At the time, such a machine did not truly exist, but it would, and when it arrived, it would not simply protect bombers. It would change the balance of the air war over Europe. The solution would not come from a desperate redesign of an existing aircraft alone. It would come from a combination of engineering innovation, industrial urgency, and a transatlantic collaboration that neither side had fully anticipated. By late 1943, something new was beginning to appear in the skies over Europe, sleek, long-nosed, and unlike anything the Luftwaffe had faced before. Its name was the P-51 Mustang. And for the first time since the bombing campaign began, American bomber crews had a real chance to survive the journey into the heart of Germany. By late 1943, the numbers were impossible to ignore. The United States Army Air Forces had committed fully to daylight strategic bombing. The idea was built on confidence and precision in formation tactics, and the defensive firepower of heavy bombers like the B-17 Flying Fortress and the B-24 Liberator. American planners believed tightly packed bomber formations could create overlapping fields of machine gun fire strong enough to defend themselves. They were wrong. The Luftwaffe adapted quickly. German pilots learned to attack on the front, exploiting the limited forward defensive coverage of early bomber formations. A head-on pass lasted only seconds, but in those seconds, cannon shells could shatter cockpits and kill entire flight crews. The bombers needed protection long before reaching the target. The Allies did have escort fighters. The Republic P-47 Thunderbolt was powerful, rugged, and heavily armed. The British Supermarine Spitfire was agile and combat-proven. Both were capable of defeating German fighters in a fair fight. But war is rarely fair, and range is unforgiving. A fighter's combat radius is not just about distance. It is about fuel consumption at cruising speed, climb rates, combat maneuvers, reserve margins, and the ability to escort bombers while remaining effective in battle. Early escort fighters simply did not have the endurance required to accompany bombers deep into German airspace. Over northern France and the Low Countries, escorts could still provide coverage. Beyond that, they had to turn back. Every bomber crew knew the moment. Fighter escorts would rock their wings, peel away, and head back toward England. The bombers would continue forward, their contrails stretching eastward into most heavily defended airspace in Europe. From that point on, they were exposed. German radar networks tracked incoming formations. Interceptor units scrambled efficiently. Waves of Bf-109s and Fw-190s assembled at altitude, striking when the bombers were farthest from Allied fighter support. The result was predictable and devastating. On October 14, 1943, the second Schweinfurt raid became known as Black Thursday. Of the 291 B-17s dispatched, 60 were shot down. Hundreds of airmen were killed, wounded, or captured. Many aircraft returned to England riddled with damage, so severe they were written off immediately. The loss rate approached 20%. No air force in the world could sustain that indefinitely. American commanders were forced to temporarily suspend deep daylight raids into Germany. It was not a matter of courage or skill. It was mathematics. If bomber losses exceeded replacement rates, the entire strategy would collapse. The Luftwaffe understood this. Their goal was not necessarily to stop every bomb from falling. It was to make the cost unbearable. Meanwhile, German industry continued to produce fighters. Even when factories were damaged, repairs were made. Production shifted. Aircraft dispersed. The bombing campaign without effective escort was bleeding itself dry. The strategic bombing doctrine depended on reaching critical industrial targets, ball bearing plants, synthetic fuel refineries, aircraft assembly lines. These facilities were often located far inland. Without long-range fighter protection, those targets were nearly untouchable. Planners in Washington and London now faced a brutal reality. The air war over Europe would not be won by bombers alone. They needed a fighter that could escort heavy bombers all the way to Berlin and fight effectively once it got there, not a short-range interceptor. Not a defensive companion limited by fuel, but a true long-range escort fighter. It had to cruise efficiently at high altitude. It had to match or exceed the performance of German interceptors. It had to carry enough fuel to cross the North Sea, penetrate deep into the Reich, engage in combat, and still return home. This was not a minor improvement. It required a fundamental shift in aircraft capability. Some believed such an aircraft was unrealistic. Long range often meant added weight. Added weight meant reduced maneuverability, and reduced maneuverability meant vulnerability in dogfights. But somewhere in development, almost overlooked at first, there was an aircraft that, with the right engine and configuration, might solve the escort problem entirely. The bomber crews did not yet know its name, but soon they would look out their cockpit windows and see something different fly beside them, sleek, fast, and stay with them far longer than any escort before. The solution to the escort problem was coming, and when it arrived, the balance of the air war would begin to shift. The Mustang was not supposed to change the war. In 1940, Britain stood alone against Nazi Germany. The Battle of Britain had proven that air power would decide the fate of nations. The Royal Air Force needed fighters, and it needed them quickly. British factories were stretched to their limits, producing Spitfires and Hurricanes. There was no time to waste. So the British Purchasing Commission approached an American company that had never built a frontline fighter before, North American Aviation. At first, the British asked the company to produce the Curtiss P-40 under license. It was a reliable aircraft, already in service. But James Dutch Kindleberger, president of North American Aviation, made a bold proposal. Instead of building someone else's design, he offered to build a completely new fighter and to deliver it faster than they could set up P-40 production lines. It was an ambitious promise. War does not reward delays. Design work began in early 1940. Engineers moved with extraordinary speed. The new aircraft would prioritize aerodynamic efficiency. It would be streamlined, clean, modern. The fuselage was carefully shaped to reduce drag. The radiator was uniquely positioned beneath the fuselage, using what engineers called a merited effect, where heated air exiting the radiator duct could actually generate a small amount of thrust. It was advanced thinking. Within just 117 days of the initial contract, the prototype NA-73X rolled out. When it first flew in October 1940, it exceeded expectations. The aircraft was fast, faster than many fighters already in service. It handled well. It had long range compared to most contemporary designs. But it was built around the Allison V 1710 engine. At the time, that choice made sense. The Allison was available, reliable, and produced in the United States. For low-altitude combat and reconnaissance, it performed adequately. The early Mustangs, designated Mustang MKI by the British, were used primarily for reconnaissance and ground attack. At lower altitudes, they were effective and survivable. Pilots praised the aircraft's speed and handling characteristics. But the strategic air war developing over Europe demanded something different. The United States would soon enter the war after the attack on Pearl Harbor. American doctrine centered around high-altitude daylight bombing. Heavy bombers would strike deep into enemy territory, and those bombers needed protection. As American involvement expanded, the Mustang's potential became clearer. It was not just another fighter. It was a design with untapped capability. Its laminar flow wing reduced drag significantly at cruising speeds. Its fuel efficiency was better than many contemporaries. The airframe was strong but relatively lightweight. The aircraft had been born from urgency. Now it was waiting for refinement. Meanwhile, the air war intensified. Bomber losses mounted. Escort fighters fell short in range. American planners began examining every possible solution. The Mustang stood out. It was not yet perfect, but it had something rare in wartime engineering, room to evolve. The early versions were stepping stones. They proved the airframe worked. They proved the design was sound. They proved that North American Aviation could produce fighters quickly and at scale. The question was no longer whether the Mustang could fly. The question was whether it could become the long-range escort the Allies desperately needed. Across factories in California and Texas, production lines expanded. Modifications were tested. Engineers refined systems. Improvements were incremental, but steady. The Mustang had been born in response to British desperation. Soon, it would become the answer to an American strategic crisis. It was not designed as a legend. It became one because the war demanded it. And with the right transformation, this fast, efficient, overlooked fighter would become the aircraft that rewrote the rules of the air war over Europe. At first, the Mustang was impressive, but it was not extraordinary. When the early P-51s entered service, they were powered by the Allison V 1710 engine. At low and medium altitudes, the aircraft performed well. It was fast, agile, and aerodynamically clean. Its laminar flow wing reduced drag. Its design was modern and efficient. But Europe's air war was fought high above the clouds. And at high altitude, the Allison struggled. The engine lacked an effective two-stage supercharger, a critical component that allowed engines to maintain power in thin air. Above 15,000 feet, performance began to drop sharply. At the altitudes where B-17s and B-24s operated, 25,000 feet and higher, the early Mustang simply could not compete with German interceptors. The airframe had potential. The engine was the limitation. Across the Atlantic, British engineers were already thinking differently. The Royal Air Force had tested the Mustang and immediately recognized the strength of its aerodynamic design. But they also saw the same weakness: altitude performance. Someone proposed an experiment that, at the time, seemed almost routine. What if the Mustang were fitted with the Rolls-Royce Merlin? The Merlin engine was already legendary. It powered the Spitfire. It powered the Hurricane. It had proven itself in the Battle of Britain. Most importantly, it featured a two-stage, two-speed supercharger, allowing it to maintain strong performance at high altitude. When engineers installed a Merlin into a Mustang airframe for testing, the results were immediate and dramatic. The transformation was not subtle. The aircraft's top speed increased significantly at altitude. Climb rate improved. High altitude maneuverability sharpened. Where the Allison-powered Mustang faded, the Merlin-powered version thrived. The sleek American airframe and the refined British engine formed something neither nation had originally envisioned. It was not just an upgrade. It was a breakthrough. In the United States, Packard Motor Car Company began producing the Merlin engine under license. Designated the Packard V1650, it would power what became the P-51B and P-51C variants. Now, the Mustang could operate effectively above 25,000 feet. Now, it could escort bombers where they needed protection most. The long nose of the aircraft became its defining silhouette, housing the Merlin engine that gave it life. Pilots quickly noticed the difference. Acceleration felt stronger. High-altitude combat no longer meant surrendering performance. For the first time, American forces had a fighter that could match and often exceed the capabilities of the Bf-109 and FW-190 at operational altitude. But engine power alone was not enough. The Mustang's true advantage lay in the combination of speed, efficiency, and fuel economy. The Merlin did not simply make the aircraft faster. It made it viable as a long-range escort fighter. With external drop tanks, the Merlin-powered P-51 could fly deeper into German airspace than any previous American fighter. The escort problem was no longer theoretical. It was being solved. Production accelerated. Squadron began converting to the new variant. Pilots trained on the upgraded aircraft, learning to trust a machine that would carry them across hostile skies. Bomber crews, at first cautious, began noticing something new during missions. The escorts were not turning back as early. They were still there, over the Dutch coast, over the Ruhr, over central Germany, and eventually over Berlin. The Merlin transformation did more than enhance an aircraft. It altered the strategic equation. For years, the Luftwaffe had relied on fighting over home territory, leveraging altitude advantage and coordinated interception. Now, a new opponent had arrived, one capable of meeting them on equal terms at the heights where the battle was decided. The Mustang was no longer just a promising design. With the Merlin engine, it became the fighter the bombing campaign had been waiting for. And the skies over Europe were about to change. Power alone does not win air wars. Speed matters. Altitude matters. Firepower matters. But in 1943, one factor mattered more than any other: range. The strategic bombing campaign required fighters that could travel hundreds of miles over hostile territory, remain combat effective, and return safely. It was not enough to win a dogfight. The escort fighter had to endure the journey. The P-51 Mustang, now powered by the Merlin engine, had something rare: efficiency. At cruising speed, the Mustang consumed less fuel than many of its contemporaries. Its laminar flow wing reduced drag significantly, especially at higher speeds. The wing's smooth profile delayed airflow separation, improving aerodynamic performance in level flight. In practical terms, this meant one thing: the Mustang could go farther. But engineers did not stop there. External drop tanks were introduced, streamlined auxiliary fuel tanks mounted under the wings. These tanks dramatically extended the aircraft's operational range. Early paper tanks were lightweight and expendable. Pilots could jettison them before entering combat to regain maneuverability. With drop tanks, the P-51's range exceeded 1,600 miles. For the first time, an American fighter could escort bombers from England to Berlin and back. That single capability changed everything. The Mustang's cockpit was designed with long missions in mind. Visibility was strong, especially in later bubble canopy variants. Controls were responsive. The aircraft was stable at high altitude, reducing pilot fatigue during hours-long escort missions. Then there was firepower. The P-51D variant carried 6.50 caliber M2 Browning machine guns mounted in the wings. Each gun was reliable, hard-hitting, and supplied with ample ammunition. Concentrated fire from these weapons could shred enemy fighters in seconds. Unlike earlier aircraft that mounted guns in the nose, the wing-mounted configuration of the P-51 allowed for heavier armament without synchronization lost through a propeller arc. When harmonized correctly, the 6 Brownings created devastating forward firepower, speed, range, firepower. But there was another advantage: altitude performance. At 25,000 feet and above, the Merlin engine maintained power where many German aircraft began to struggle. The Mustang could dive aggressively, climb rapidly, and accelerate smoothly in combat. German pilots quickly learned that this was not just another escort fighter. It could hunt. As tactics evolved, Mustang pilots were no longer required to stay tightly attached to bomber formations. Instead, they were given increasing freedom to range ahead, intercept German fighters before they could organize attacks, and sweep airfields. The role shifted from passive escort to offensive air dominance. The Mustang was not just protecting bombers. It was clearing the sky. Its long range also allowed it to strafe locomotives, destroy ground targets, and disrupt German transportation networks after escort duties were completed. No other Allied fighter combined such endurance with such versatility at that stage of the war. Engineering decisions that may have seemed incremental in isolation, a refined wing profile, an efficient cooling system, carefully managed weight distribution, combined to produce an aircraft uniquely suited to the strategic needs of 1944. The P-51 was not the heaviest fighter. It was not the most armored. It was not even the first long-range aircraft conceived. But it was the first to combine range, speed, altitude performance, and firepower in a single balanced design at exactly the moment the Allies needed it most. In war, timing is everything. By early 1944, squadrons equipped with P-51s were ready. The escort problem had been solved not by a single invention, but by engineering harmony. The Mustang was now what it had the potential to become all along: the perfect escort. By early 1944, the Mustang was no longer a promising experiment. It was operational. Squadrons of P-51B and P-51C fighters began deploying to England in increasing numbers. Pilots transitioning from the P-47 Thunderbolt or P-38 Lightning immediately noticed the difference. The Mustang felt lighter on the controls. It accelerated smoothly. At high altitude, it did not struggle for breath. But the real test would not come in training flights over the English countryside. It would come over Germany. The first deep penetration escort missions marked a turning point. As bomber formations crossed the North Sea and moved inland, something unprecedented happened. The escort stayed over the Dutch coast, over the Ruhr Valley, over central Germany, and for the first time, over Berlin. German radar stations detected the incoming formations as usual. Interceptors scrambled. Luftwaffe pilots climbed rapidly to meet the bombers, expecting the familiar pattern. Escort fighters turning back before the bombers reached the most heavily defended airspace. But this time, the pattern broke. The Mustangs did not peel away. They climbed higher. Instead of waiting passively near the bombers, many P-51 units were granted increasing tactical freedom. Rather than flying in tight proximity to bomber formations, they began sweeping ahead, intercepting German fighters before they could organize coordinated attacks. The escort had evolved into a hunter. Mustang pilots quickly learned how to exploit their aircraft strengths. At altitude, the Merlin engine gave them confidence. The P-51 could dive with tremendous speed, converting altitude into momentum. In a climb, it maintained performance longer than many adversaries. The Luftwaffe still possessed skilled pilots. The Bf-109 and FW-190 were dangerous opponents. But German forces were increasingly strained. facing pilot shortages, fuel limitations, and relentless Allied bombing. The arrival of the Mustang multiplied those pressures. On long escort missions, P-51 pilots observed German fighters assembling for attacks on bomber formations. Rather than waiting for contact, Mustangs engaged early, disrupting formations before they could execute coordinated strikes. Every intercepted attack meant fewer bombers lost. Every destroyed German fighter meant fewer experienced pilots defending the Reich. The psychological shift was just as important as the tactical one. Bomber crews began noticing something new during missions. The sky did not feel as empty once escorts passed their traditional fuel limit. The sense of abandonment, the moment when fighters turned back, began to disappear. Instead, silver Mustangs remained visible off the wings of heavy bombers, contrails weaving through the thin air. Loss rates began to decline. Not immediately, not dramatically overnight, but steadily. In early 1944, during Big Week, a massive Allied campaign targeting German aircraft production, Mustangs played a critical role. Escort fighters engaged Luftwaffe units repeatedly across multiple days of intense combat. The goal was not just to protect bombers. It was to force the Luftwaffe into the air and wear it down. The strategy worked. German fighter losses increased. Experienced pilots were killed or captured. Replacement training struggled to keep pace. Fuel shortages limited flight hours for new recruits. The air war was shifting from defense of bombers to domination of airspace. Mustang pilots pushed aggressively. After escort duties were completed, many units strafed airfields, locomotives, and ground targets of opportunity. The P-51's range allowed it to strike deep into German infrastructure and still return to base. It was no longer simply an escort fighter. It was an instrument of sustained pressure. The Luftwaffe now faced a grim reality. Allied bombers were reaching critical industrial targets with increasing frequency, and their escorts were no longer predictable. The skies over Europe had changed. For the first time since the bombing campaign began, the Allies were not merely enduring the air war, they were beginning to control it. And the P-51 Mustang was at the center of that transformation. By mid-1944, the air war over Europe was no longer a question of survival. It had become a war of attrition. For years, the Luftwaffe had defended the skies over Germany with discipline and precision. Radar networks provided early warning. Fighter wings were strategically positioned. Experienced pilots, many hardened by combat on multiple fronts, climbed to intercept Allied bombers with confidence. But now, something had changed. The bombers were still coming. Only this time, they were not alone. With the arrival of large numbers of Merlin-powered P-51 Mustangs, Allied escort strategy shifted from reactive defense to aggressive air dominance. Mustang groups were increasingly ordered to range far ahead of bomber formations. They patrolled likely interception routes. They swept airfields. They attacked German fighters during takeoff and landing. The mission was no longer just protection. It was destruction. German fighter units found themselves under constant pressure. Every attempt to intercept bomber streams risked immediate engagement with long-range escorts. Even assembling into formation became dangerous. The Mustang's range allowed it to loiter, to wait, to strike first. The Luftwaffe still fought fiercely. The Bf-109 remained a capable high-altitude interceptor. The FW-190 was heavily armed and formidable in a dive, but the strategic context had shifted against Germany. Fuel shortages were growing acute. Allied bombing of synthetic fuel plants began to cripple aviation gasoline production. Training hours for new German pilots were reduced dramatically. Experience levels declined. Meanwhile, American pilot training programs expanded. Replacement aircraft arrived in steady numbers. Production lines in the United States operated at an industrial scale Germany could no longer match. The air war became unequal, not in courage, but in capacity. During the months leading up to D-Day, Allied strategy intensified. Air superiority over France and Western Germany was essential for the success of the coming invasion. The Luftwaffe had to be weakened, fragmented, and exhausted before Allied troops landed in Normandy. Mustang units played a central role. Escort missions turned into fighter sweeps. Strafing runs targeted locomotives, convoys, and airfields. German aircraft caught on the ground were destroyed before ever reaching altitude. Losses mounted. Each destroyed fighter meant more than metal and machinery. It meant a trained pilot, often irreplaceable by 1944, removed from the war. By spring 1944, German fighter strength in Western Europe had been severely degraded. Operational readiness declined. Units were forced to disperse, relocate, and conserve resources. The skies that once belonged to the Luftwaffe were becoming increasingly contested, and then increasingly dominated. The psychological impact was profound. Bomber crews began noticing fewer organized mass attacks. Interception still occurred, but the scale and coordination of earlier years diminished. The fear that once defined deep penetration raids began to ease. For German pilots, the experience was reversed. Climbing to intercept no longer meant engaging only bombers. It meant facing agile, well-armed escorts already positioned at altitude. The Mustang was not invincible. Pilots were still lost. Aircraft were still shot down. But the balance had shifted. By the time Allied forces launched Operation Overlord in June 1944, air superiority over the invasion beaches was overwhelming. German air response was limited and fragmented. The Luftwaffe had not collapsed overnight. It had been worn down, systematically, relentlessly. The long-range escort fighter had enabled sustained pressure on Germany's defensive air system. Combined with strategic bombing of industry and fuel production, the Mustang's presence in the sky accelerated the erosion of German air power. The breaking of the Luftwaffe was not a single battle. It was a campaign. And at the center of that campaign flew the P-51 Mustang, escorting, hunting, and reshaping the air war one mission at a time. Air superiority was never the final objective. It was the means. By 1944, the Allies understood that destroying Germany's capacity to wage war required more than winning dogfights. It required dismantling the industrial backbone that sustained the Wehrmacht, the Luftwaffe, and the entire war economy. Steel, oil, transportation, synthetic fuel. These were the true targets. For years, strategic bombing had attempted to strike at these arteries, but without consistent long-range escort, deep penetration into German heartland came at staggering cost. Now, with the P-51 Mustang extending protective reach across the Reich, the bombing campaign entered a new phase. Sustained pressure. Mustangs escorted heavy bombers toward oil refineries in places like Ploiești, toward synthetic fuel plants in Ruhr, toward aircraft factories producing Bf-109s and FW-190s. But unlike earlier phases of the war, the escorts did not simply shield bombers from attack. They ensured the bombers arrived. And they ensured German fighters paid a price for attempting interception. With reliable escort coverage, Allied planners could prioritize critical infrastructure targets deep inside Germany. Synthetic fuel production became a primary objective. Without aviation gasoline, tanks would stall. Aircraft would remain grounded. Training programs would shrink further. The Mustang's range made these missions possible. As bomber formations crossed hundreds of miles of hostile territory, P-51s maintained patrols along the route. If Luftwaffe fighters rose to challenge them, Mustangs engaged aggressively. If the skies remained clear, they continued escort duty, conserving fuel, maintaining altitude discipline, watching for threats. Once bombs were released and formations began the long journey home, many Mustangs still had fuel reserves. That endurance allowed secondary missions. Rail yards were strafed, locomotives destroyed, bridges attacked, supply convoys scattered. The P-51 6.50 caliber machine guns proved devastating against lightly armored ground targets. The cumulative effect was enormous. Transportation networks became unreliable. Fuel distribution faltered. Factories, even when repaired, struggled to receive raw materials or ship finished aircraft. The German war machine, once efficient and coordinated, began to fragment under relentless pressure from above. It was not one dramatic explosion that crippled German industry. It was repetition, daily missions, repeated strikes, continuous escort coverage that made interruption of the bombing campaign increasingly difficult. The Mustang did not drop the bombs, but without it, many of those bombs would never have reached their targets. By late 1944, Allied bombing had significantly reduced Germany's fuel production. Luftwaffe units faced crippling shortages. Aircraft sat grounded not because they were destroyed, but because there was no fuel to fly them. Training hours for new pilots declined further. Experienced veterans were irreplaceable. Operational readiness deteriorated across fighter wings. The strategic bombing campaign had finally achieved what early planners had envisioned: sustained degradation of enemy capacity. And the P-51 Mustang had been essential in enabling that shift. The aircraft's presence allowed the Allies to project power farther, more consistently, and with greater survivability than ever before. It turned deep penetration raids from high-risk gambles into calculated operations backed by reliable protection. Air power had reach. Now it had endurance. As 1944 turned toward 1945, the skies over Germany belonged increasingly to the Allies. Bombers flew with greater confidence. Escort fighters patrolled aggressively. The industrial core of the Reich, once shielded by distance and air defense networks, lay exposed. The Mustang had extended the arm of Allied strategy, and that arm reached deep into the heart of the Third Reich. By early 1945, the P-51 Mustang had already secured its place in the skies over Europe. But its story did not end there. The aircraft that had helped break the Luftwaffe was not confined to a single theater of war. Its range, speed, and adaptability made it valuable far beyond the European continent. Across the Pacific, the air war presented different challenges. Distances were vast. Targets were separated by oceans and island chains. Supply lines stretched across thousands of miles. Fighter escorts faced the same fundamental problem as in Europe: range, but on an even greater scale. The Mustang was uniquely suited to meet that challenge. In the Pacific theater, long-range missions were essential for escorting B-29 Superfortress bombers attacking Japanese industrial targets. While earlier fighters struggled with the enormous distances involved, the P-51's fuel efficiency and drop tank capability allowed it to operate effectively from newly captured island bases. From Iwo Jima, P-51 units began escorting B-29s on missions over the Japanese home islands. These were long, demanding flights over open ocean. Navigation errors could be fatal. Mechanical failure meant ditching into vast waters with little chance of rescue. The Mustang proved reliable. Its Merlin engine performed well at altitude. Its endurance allowed it to remain with bomber formations deep into Japanese airspace. When Japanese interceptors rose to meet the B-29s, Mustangs engaged aggressively, often at high altitude, where the air was thin and unforgiving. Just as in Europe, the P-51 provided something invaluable: confidence. Bomber crews heading toward heavily defended targets no longer felt entirely exposed. Escort fighters were present, visible in formation, weaving above and around the bombers. But the Mustang's role in the Pacific was not limited to escort. As Japanese air resistance weakened, P-51s conducted ground attack missions. They strafed airfields, supply depots, and transportation routes. The aircraft versatility once again proved decisive. By the end of the war, the Mustang had become more than an escort fighter. It had become a symbol. Pilots praised its handling. Many described it as balanced, responsive without being unstable, powerful without being unwieldy. It could dogfight, dive, climb, and cruise efficiently over long distances. It was not the heaviest or most armored aircraft of the war, but it combined its strengths in a way few fighters ever had. Even after the Second World War ended, the Mustang's service did not immediately conclude. It would continue flying in various air forces around the world. In the Korean War, early jet aircraft began to dominate the skies, but Mustangs still served in ground attack roles, demonstrating that piston-engine fighters had not yet completely faded from relevance. The aircraft evolved from wartime necessity into post-war legend. Air races featured surplus Mustangs modified for speed. Museums preserved them. Restored examples flew in commemorative air shows decades later, their distinctive silhouette instantly recognizable. The long nose, the bubble canopy, the low, sweeping wings. The P-51 Mustang had traveled far from its origins as a hurried British contract fighter. It had crossed continents. It had escorted bombers over Berlin and Tokyo. It had adapted to multiple theaters of war. Few aircraft in history achieved such geographic reach or operational flexibility in such a short span of time. Its legacy extended beyond statistics of victories or production numbers. It represented a moment when engineering precision met strategic necessity, and delivered at exactly the right time. The Mustang was not bound to Europe. It belonged to the wider story of Allied air power, and its final chapter would define how the air war of World War II was remembered. The P-51 Mustang stories ultimately won a transformation, not just of an aircraft, but how air power shaped modern warfare. When it first took the skies over Europe in 1942, the Mustang was a promising design, built initially to meet British requirements. Yet, by 1944-45, it had become indispensable to the Allies. Its combination of speed, maneuverability, range, and firepower allowed it to do what few fighters before could: escort heavy bombers deep into enemy territory with confidence, engage enemy fighters at altitude, and strike ground targets with precision. Its impact was measured in both numbers and psychological effect. Bomber crews who once feared flying over heavily defended cities now felt the presence of a capable protector. Luftwaffe pilots, long dominant in the skies over Europe, found themselves outmatched. The Mustang's high-altitude performance and the 1,500 horsepower Rolls-Royce Merlin engine gave it the ability to climb rapidly, dive aggressively, and sustain long sorties that German aircraft simply could not match. Beyond Europe, the Mustang proved its worth in the Pacific. Its long-range capabilities allowed B-29 Superfortress crews to feel safe over Japan. Its versatility in strafing and reconnaissance missions made it invaluable in diverse theaters. Few aircraft in history could claim such global operational impact in such a short period. The Mustang's legacy is also a testament to engineering ingenuity and industrial capacity. Its airframe, designed for speed and agility, was paired with an engine capable of maintaining performance at high altitudes. Its fuel system, combined with drop tanks, extended operational range to unprecedented levels for a fighter of its time. Its armament of 6.50 caliber M2 Browning machine guns provided both the volume and lethality needed to destroy enemy aircraft and soft ground targets alike. Even in post-war years, the Mustang remained relevant. During the early stages of the Korean War, Mustangs adapted to ground attack roles, showing that careful design could extend the operational life of a piston-engine fighter into the jet age. Surplus aircraft found new life in air racing, training programs, and later in historical preservation, a testament to the enduring respect for its capabilities. But the P-51 Mustang's true achievement is not measured in races, air shows, or museum displays. It is measured in survival, in mission success, and in the shifting balance of air power during World War II. Its introduction allowed the Allies to dominate the skies, protect vital bomber campaigns, and pave the way for the ultimate defeat of Axis air forces. Pilots who flew the Mustang often described it as intuitive, a machine that responded to thought as much as control inputs. Its bubble canopy provided unparalleled visibility, while its sleek design combined aerodynamic efficiency with strength. In the hands of skilled aviators, the Mustang was more than a machine. It was a force multiplier, an instrument of both precision and intimidation. When the war ended, the P-51 had not only changed aerial combat tactics, but also the expectations of what a fighter aircraft could achieve. Long-range escort, combined air superiority and ground attack capability, and the psychological reassurance it provided to bomber crews created a new standard. Allied air power was no longer merely about numerical superiority. It was about leveraging advanced, adaptable technology to achieve strategic advantage. Today, the P-51 Mustang is immortalized in history books, documentaries, and museums. Its iconic shape is instantly recognizable, a symbol of innovation, skill, and the decisive role of air power in World War II. But more than that, it represents the story of countless pilots who risked everything in its cockpits, relying on the trustworthiness of a machine that could, and did, change the outcome of war. The Mustang's legacy lives on, In every aircraft that combines speed, range, and precision, in every escort mission that ensures bombers reach their target safely, and an enduring belief that engineering excellence can determine the course of history, from the skies over Europe to the Pacific Islands, and finally into the imagination of generations of aviation enthusiasts. The P-51 Mustang will forever be remembered as a fighter that gave bombers a chance to survive and, in doing so, helped shape the modern air war.